When we think of American slavery, the most common images that come to mind are those of cotton fields, whipping posts, and auction blocks. But buried in the darker, often unspoken corners of history lies an even more disturbing reality, one that most textbooks choose to ignore. This cruel act is referred to as slave breeding. It is a calculated, inhumane system that turned human reproduction into an economic strategy. After the transatlantic slave trade was officially outlawed in 1808, the American slave economy faced a pressing dilemma: how to maintain and expand its labor force without the ability to import more Africans. The solution was as cruel as it was profitable. Enslaved people themselves would become a self-replenishing source of wealth. To meet this demand, plantation owners, particularly in Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina, systematically began to force enslaved women to reproduce. This practice was not merely a byproduct of slavery. It became one of its central engines. The bodies of black men and women were commodified, and their reproductive capacity was exploited not only to sustain the slave population, but to guarantee generational control and long-term economic gain. By the early 19th century, the economic rationale for slave breeding was undeniable. The Upper South, especially Virginia, had become overstocked with enslaved people due to the decline of tobacco's profitability. Meanwhile, the Deep South's booming cotton and sugar plantations required a constant influx of labor. The horrifyingly simple solution was an increase in slave breeding. In a short while, Virginia emerged as a hub for this internal trade, with enslaved people often marching hundreds of miles to slave markets in cities like New Orleans. Plantation records indicate an unbelievable degree of organization. An example is Thomas Jefferson, who not only sired children with an enslaved woman, Sally Hemings, but also maintained precise records of births. Monticello. This ruthless practice carried many disturbing facets, and in today's video, we'll be exploring 10 shocking facts you may not know about it. But before we dive in, kindly support our work by hitting the subscribe button if you haven't. Smash the thumbs up button in front of this video and share it with your friends, family, and anyone who deserves to hear the truth about America's hidden past. Without further ado, let's dive straight in. 1. Economic motivation. The prohibition on the importation of slaves into the United States after 1808 limited the supply of slaves in the United States. This came at a time when the invention of the cotton gin enabled the expansion of cultivation in the uplands of short staple cotton, leading to clearing lands, cultivating cotton through large areas of the Deep South, especially the Black Belt. The demand for labor in the area increased sharply and led to an expansion of the internal slave market. At the same time, the Upper South had an excess number of enslaved people because of a shift to mixed crops agriculture, which was less labor-intensive than tobacco. To add to the supply of enslaved people, enslavers looked at the fertility of enslaved women as part of their productivity and intermittently forced the women to have large numbers of children. During this time, the terms breeders, breeding slaves, childbearing women, breeding period, and too old to breed became familiar. Planters in the Upper South states started selling enslaved people to the Deep South, generally through slave traders such as Franklin and Armfield. Louisville, Kentucky, on the Ohio River was a major slave market and port for shipping slaves downriver by the Mississippi to the south. New Orleans had the largest slave market in the country and became the fourth largest city in the U.S. by 1840 and the wealthiest, mostly because of its slave trade and associated businesses. 2. Forced reproduction. For 350 years, slavery was the core of Brazil's economy. About 40% of the 10 million enslaved Africans brought to the New World were taken to Brazil. For centuries, every African who came here became a slave. Slaves were so crucial to the economy that they did all the work, everything, while the white Brazilians did nothing. This country was also the last in the Americas to abolish slavery. When the government abolished the international slave trade in the country in 1850, the demand for black labor was still going strong. If enslaved women didn't bear enough children to replace old and dying workers, the Brazilian economy would have collapsed. The slave society would have crumbled. To get more slaves, enslaved Africans were forced to procreate. This slave breeding system worked as a factory. Enslaved Africans gave birth to more babies who would be born as slaves, so they could work on plantations or any job as free labor. Sometimes slave breeders were used. At other times, slave owners would force women to make more slaves. One such breeding slave was Roque José Florencio, also known as Pata Seca. He was born in 1828 and was forced to father about 249 children with different women. This made him a direct ancestor to about 30% of the population of Santa Eudoxia, São Carlos. 3. A child's fate is decided based on the mother's status. Partus sequitur ventrem is a Latin word which means the offspring follows the womb. It was a legal doctrine passed in colonial Virginia in 1662 and other English crown colonies in the Americas, which defined the legal status of children born there. The doctrine mandated that children of enslaved mothers would inherit the legal status of their mothers. As such, children of enslaved women would be born into slavery. The legal doctrine of partus sequitur ventrem was derived from Roman civil law, specifically the portions concerning slavery and personal property, as well as the common law of personal property. The doctrine's most significant effect was placing into chattel slavery all children born to enslaved women. Partus sequitur ventrem soon spread from the colony of Virginia to all of the 13 colonies. As a function of the political economy of chattel slavery in colonial America, the legalism of partus sequitur ventrem exempted the biological father from relationship toward children he fathered with enslaved women and gave all rights in the children to the slave owner. The denial of paternity to enslaved children secured the slaveholder's right to profit from exploiting the labor of children engendered, bred, and born into slavery. The doctrine also meant that multiracial children with white mothers were born free. Early generations of free Negroes in the American South were formed from unions between free, working class, usually mixed-race women and black men. Similar legal doctrines of inheritable slavery also derived from the civil law, operated in all the various European colonies in the Americas and Africa, which were established by the British, Spanish, Portuguese, French, or Dutch, and these doctrines often carried over after the colonies became independent. 4. Medical exploitation. Long before modern medicine was polished and regulated, the bodies of enslaved black people were treated as a resource, tools for experimentation, servitude, and economy. The term medical exploitation in slave breeding refers to the use of enslaved black bodies without consent, protection, or dignity for the advancement of medical science, economic gain, reproductive control, and the solidification of racial hierarchy. On plantations and in colonial settings, black men and women were not treated as patients, they were regarded as properties. Enslaved women, for instance, were reframed by physicians not as individuals in need of care, but as reproducers and laborers whose bodies existed for profit and plantation survival. Perhaps one of the most infamous cases is that of Dr. James Marion Sims, often hailed as the father of modern gynecology. Between 1845 and 1849, Sims conducted experimental pelvic surgeries on at least 7 enslaved black women, among them Anarcha, Westcott, Lucy, and Betsy, without anesthesia and without their consent. Sims claimed that black women experienced less pain than white women, a reflection not of medical truth, but of racial myth. His success, built on their suffering, enabled him to refine techniques that later benefited white women, while the black women who bore the cost remained invisible. 5. Family separation. After Congress banned the international slave trade in 1808, growing Southern demand for enslaved agricultural labor fueled the largest domestic slave trade in history. From 1790 to 1865, more than 1 million enslaved black people were sold to traders in the Upper South, moved hundreds of miles to the Lower South by rail or boat, or forced to march on foot in chained coffles and then sold again. This physically brutal and inhumane enterprise devastated Black families. Roughly half of all enslaved people were separated from their spouses and parents. About 1 in 4 of those sold were children. Ads for Thomas L. Fraser and Co. Slave Mart in Montgomery, Alabama, boasted that it had constantly on hand a large and well-selected stock of Black boys and girls. Slaveholders threatened separation to maintain control, forcing enslaved people to live with the constant fear of losing a loved one. Even those who were not traded across regions could be sold away from relatives at an owner's whim, to divide an estate, settle a debt, or as punishment. In South Carolina, courts conducted half of all sales of enslaved people who were divided up and sold individually. In Missouri, 30% of enslaved people sold by the court were younger than 15. After emancipation, formerly enslaved people used newspaper ads, church bulletins, and word of mouth to search for family members lost through sale, sometimes decades earlier. Though often unsuccessful, their efforts illustrate the enduring bonds of family and the lasting pain of separation. Roughly half of all enslaved people were separated from their spouses and parents. About 1 in 4 of those sold were children. 6. Memory and narrative suppression. One of the most insidious horrors of slave breeding was not just the physical exploitation, but the deliberate erasure of its memory and narrative. Slave breeding was a system so brutal, dehumanizing, and morally repugnant that even after slavery ended, the American society conspired through silence, denial, and revisionism to suppress its full truth from public consciousness. For decades, history books avoided or softened the reality of how enslaved Black men and women were forced to reproduce for economic gain. The narratives of those who endured this trauma were systematically excluded from classrooms, public discourse, and national memory. Instead, sanitized versions of slavery were promoted. The ones that downplayed the violence, obscured the sexual exploitation, and erased the complex family structures that were destroyed. This suppression wasn't accidental. It served a purpose, one meant to preserve the image of American progress while ignoring the foundational atrocities it was built upon. It also prevented generations of African Americans from accessing the full truths of their ancestral history, forcing them to piece together fragmented legacies that were intentionally buried. 7. Stock books and slave birth records. On many plantations, enslaved people were not seen as human beings, but as assets to be tracked, traded, and evaluated. One of the most disturbing examples of this dehumanization was the practice of keeping stock books and plantation ledgers that detailed the reproductive lives of enslaved women. Slaveholders recorded not just the names and ages of the enslaved, but also pregnancies, childbirths, and the physical condition of both mothers and their children. These records were often as meticulous as those used for livestock. Enslaved women's fertility was monitored like a commodity, with their ability to reproduce seen as a crucial economic asset. Some plantation owners even projected future yields, estimating how many children a woman might bear in her lifetime and calculating her value based on that number. The value of enslaved children was also noted, often appraised by gender, health, and the perceived strength of the parents. These ledgers allowed enslavers to plan sales, estimate labor capacity, and determine how much profit could be generated by each family unit. It reduced people to numbers and reproductive statistics, stripping them of identity and autonomy. 8. The commodification of enslaved Black men as breeding studs. One of the most disturbing yet often overlooked aspects of slave breeding in American history is the use of enslaved Black men as breeding studs or stock. Selected for their height, physical strength, and perceived health, these men were not viewed as human beings, but as tools to produce more valuable enslaved offspring. This practice reflected the deeply dehumanizing mindset of the time, in which enslaved individuals were stripped of autonomy and reduced to their physical utility. Slaveholders believed that pairing a strong, tall male with a fertile female would yield children who were better suited for labor, especially in the physically demanding cotton, tobacco, and sugar plantations. These forced pairings had nothing to do with family, love, or choice. Enslaved men had no say in whom they were forced to impregnate. Often, they were made to mate with multiple women across the plantation or even sent to neighboring plantations for the same purpose. 9. Nutritional deprivation. One of the lesser known but deeply disturbing aspects of slave breeding was nutritional deprivation, the deliberate withholding of adequate food as both a tool of control and a means of manipulation. Schools rarely address this reality, but nutrition played a critical role in the reproductive exploitation of enslaved people, especially women. On breeding plantations, enslaved women were often forced to reproduce continuously while receiving minimal nourishment. Despite being pregnant or nursing, they were still expected to perform hard labor under brutal conditions. Adequate prenatal or postpartum care was non-existent. Slaveholders did not prioritize the health of the mother, only the birth of a marketable child. Food rations were deliberately limited. Enslaved people were given just enough to survive, usually a basic allowance of cornmeal, lard, or molasses. Nutrient-rich foods like meat, vegetables, or dairy were rare luxuries and often withheld. This led to widespread malnutrition, stunted growth in children, and health complications for both mother and child. Yet, enslavers expected strong, breedable offspring despite starving the very people tasked with producing them. This deprivation was not just negligence, it was a form of reproductive control. By keeping enslaved people physically weak, enslavers reduced the chances of rebellion or escape while still exploiting them for both labor and childbirth. Malnourished bodies were easier to dominate, and yet they were still forced into cycles of unwanted pregnancy and childbearing. Nutritional deprivation is one of many brutal strategies used to sustain the economics of slave breeding, and it's a painful truth that educational systems too often avoid. Understanding this fact helps expose the full cruelty of slavery not just as a system of labor, but as a calculated regime of human exploitation at every level. 10. Existence of slave breeding plantations. Just as there were rice, tobacco, and sugar plantations during the era of American slavery, there also existed a more horrifying and lesser-known type called slave breeding plantations. These plantations weren't built around agricultural production. Instead, they were centers where enslaved people were systematically forced to reproduce in order to meet the growing demand for slave labor, especially after the U.S. banned the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. With no new slaves legally arriving from Africa, the American South, particularly the Deep South, still needed labor for the booming cotton and sugar industries. The Upper South, especially Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina, became central hubs in what would evolve into a domestic slave trade. These regions had surplus enslaved populations due to declining profitability of crops like tobacco, and plantation owners found a new economic opportunity, forcing the birth of more enslaved people to sell. Slave breeding plantations focused almost entirely on reproduction. Enslaved women were valued for their fertility rather than their labor, and men were selected based on their physical strength or health, often referred to as studs or stockmen. These men were forced to impregnate women under orders. Consent was never a factor. These were forced pairings, often repeated with multiple partners, designed to maximize the number of children born into slavery. Children born on these breeding farms were raised just long enough to survive, only to be sold off, frequently torn away from their mothers at extremely young ages. Families were deliberately broken apart. While direct documentation of breeding plantations is limited due to either destruction of records or reluctance to preserve such a shameful legacy, historical accounts, oral histories, and slave narratives reveal their undeniable existence. Places in Virginia and other parts of the Upper South have been referenced as locations of such practices, though they were often cloaked in vague language like Negro farms. Charles Ball, a slave from Maryland, commented on a slave market that sold pregnant slaves. The stranger, who was a thin, weather-beaten, sunburned figure, then said he wanted a couple of breeding wenches and would give as much for them as they would bring in Georgia. He then walked along our line as we stood chained together and looked at the whole of us, then turning to the women, asked the prices of the 2 pregnant ones. Our master replied that these were 2 of the best breeding wenches in all Maryland, that one was 22 and the other only 19, that the first was already the mother of 7 children and the other of 4, that he had himself seen the children at the time he bought their mothers, and that such wenches would be cheap at $1,000 each. But as they were not able to keep up with the gang, he would take $1,200 for the 2. Young women were often advertised for sale as good breeding stock. To encourage childbearing, some population owners promised women slaves their freedom after they had produced 15 children. One slave trader from Virginia boasted that his successful breeding policies enabled him to sell 6,000 slave children a year. It has been claimed that plantation owners were often the fathers of slave children. Harriet Jacobs, a house slave in Edenton, North Carolina, recounted in her autobiography that when she reached the age of 15, her enslaver, Dr. Norcom, began to whisper inappropriate and foul words in her ear. Though she was still very young, she understood the meaning behind his advances. She tried to respond with indifference or contempt. Due to his older age, her extreme youth, and the fear that his actions would be reported to her grandmother, Dr. Norcom tolerated her resistance for many months. He was described as a cunning man who used various tactics to achieve his aims. At times, he exhibited a stormy and terrifying demeanor that left his victims trembling. At other times, he feigned gentleness in an attempt to break their resistance. Harriet later explained that of the 2 approaches, she preferred his stormy moods, even though they frightened her, but they were at least predictable. She also revealed that several young enslaved girls eventually gave in to his demands. According to Jacobs, Dr. Norcom was, to her knowledge, the father of 11 enslaved children. Olaudah Equiano was another enslaved individual who personally witnessed the sexual abuse and rape of several enslaved women. He was frequently placed in charge of various cargoes of newly captured Africans intended for sale. It was almost routine for the clerks and other white men to violently violate the chastity of the female slaves. Despite his deep reluctance, he was powerless to intervene and was forced to allow these abuses to happen. When some of these enslaved individuals were transported on his master's ships to other islands or to America, he observed the shipmates committing these vile acts openly and shamelessly, acts that brought disgrace not only upon Christianity but upon humanity itself. He even recalled instances where these men satisfied their perverse desires with girls under the age of 10. Henry Bibb, a slave from Shelby County, Kentucky, also stated in a recent report that a poor slave's wife can never be true to her husband, contrary to the will of her master. She can neither be pure nor virtuous, contrary to the will of her master. She dare not refuse to be reduced to a state of adultery at the will of her master. From all ramifications, it is obvious that slave breeding was not just a footnote. It was a cruel system built on control, profit, and complete disregard for Black humanity. These are the stories most schools won't teach, but we must remember them because silence only protects the oppressor. As we bring this video to an end, kindly support our efforts by smashing the thumbs button, share this video, and subscribe so more people can know the truth they were never told. This is Black history, our fight, and our voice. Thanks for watching. Until next time, see you in our next video.